Assistance. Gus founded Project Assistance in 1996 to transform our clients' approach to portfolio and project management to achieve a standard of excellence in execution that consistently delivers expected project outcomes. Gus is a portfolio and project management expert. He's a published author of many popular articles and books on the subject of project management, including contributions to several editions of Macmillan's popular Q-Book series, Special Edition, using Microsoft Project. He's also the author of the project management content in the 3rd edition of Expediting Drug and Biologics Development, and has been a presenter at several national meetings of the Drug Information Association. Gus?
Thank you, Jan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll start off today's presentation with a brief review of our agenda. First, we're going to talk about the subject of rescues. Why are they necessary? The symptoms, root causes, and solutions. Once we talk about the solutions, we're going to take a closer look at some of the details of those solutions. We'll discuss next steps and talk a little bit about what we do. And then, as Jan mentioned, we'll open the question and answer console. Actually, the question and answer console will remain open throughout the presentation, but once we get beyond the next steps part of our presentation, we'll go ahead and process those questions. So the first thing we want to talk about is why rescues are necessary. The first thing I wanted to speak about was from our experience. We've done over 200 Microsoft Project Server implementations, and about 90% of those fail to progress beyond the initial pilot stage, meaning something gets installed and then it gets stalled. And many of those pilots that stall fail to deliver the anticipated benefits. So when we talk about a rescue or the necessity for a rescue or a failure, we're talking about those 9 out of 10 implementations that really don't get beyond the initial pilot and really don't deliver on the expectations that were anticipated when the initial solution implementation was conceived and begun. Then there's really 2 paths organizations take. There's sort of a write-off path, which is the investment is made, the failure occurs, and the organization writes off the cost of the failure and seeks some other option in order to really go after a solution like enterprise project management, including a decision not to do anything and to do nothing and go back to the old ways. Some organizations will make an attempt to rescue their investment, and they happen for a variety of reasons. Organizations oftentimes will spend well over 6 figures both in software as well as services, whether external or internal. And once those investments are made and the initial benefits are not foreseen, after some period of time, oftentimes from management, a mandate will come down to require that we have I'm going to have to ask folks if they could please put their phones on mute. Sounds like somebody might have gotten access to our organizer dial-in information. Some organizations will write off the cost of the failure while others will make an attempt to rescue the investment. And that rescue usually comes on the heels of, we made an investment, it didn't work, but we're not going to get away with a write-off. So it's really going to be those situations that we're talking about this afternoon. And the basic premise for the presentation is that there's a problem that needs to be solved. And often what happens is we see treatment of the symptoms. So I want to talk a little bit about the symptoms, what the real underlying problems are, and what the solutions are to those problems. So instead of treating the symptoms, we really want to uncover the real problems. So I'm going to go through a series of some problems here, and we'll talk about the solutions. The first symptom we see is a concern. We hear things like, well, we're not using it because we can't trust the information. So people don't use the enterprise project management solution because they don't go to this technology and because they can't trust it. Now, usually that happens because the project managers aren't providing timely project planning, tracking, and variance information. And so, the information's out there, but it's not timely. It would almost be better if there was no information out there, because when the information's out there and it's incongruous or out of sync with the reality that many people understand to be happening on the project, then there's a concern about the solution not being a trusted source of project and portfolio status information. The solution usually is some kind of a support infrastructure for the mentoring and coaching of the project managers that drives project management capabilities beyond the basic capabilities that project managers have. So what we usually see is that the project managers have been asked to do something that they're not really prepared to do. There's been an implementation of the solution, and for a whole variety of reasons, including the lack of reviews and audits and follow-up, the solution is not really being used the way it should be used. The other solution is to provide a governance process that includes stakeholder intervention, escalation, project scope management, cancellation, and linkage to performance evaluation and compensation systems. Now that's a mouthful, so let me break that down just a little bit, and we'll go into a little bit more detail when we get into the solution details. The governance processes really are, in our view, a set of processes that are in parallel to the project management processes. In other words, when a project management solution is implemented, there's oftentimes thought about suggesting to the project management community what processes, or let's say mandating what processes ought to be used in order for that technology to be used in a way that really provides a return on the investment. But there's not really a formal set of governance processes that really governs and ensures that the project managers are getting skilled and are well supported so that they can really take advantage of the solution. The second symptom I want to talk about, and this is one of the most common occurrences we see with the challenges, or really the need to rescue these solutions, or an inability to balance resource demands against resource capacity. Most organizations that embark on an enterprise project management solution are not looking to stop at schedule management, meaning that, you know, if we think about project management tools, the most fundamental things people tend to do initially with project management tools is to build a Gantt chart or a schedule. And most organizations, when they go to enterprise project management, are looking to get some benefit out of the resource capacities or the resource planning capacities of these tools, meaning the ability to balance the demands for resource against capacity. And so the symptom we see is that we can't get our resources balanced. We can't, there's no way we can get an accurate view of the demand versus the capacity. And the cause for that is usually that there's not a realistic approach for defining, analyzing, and balancing resource demands against resource capacity. And really the key here is the word realistic. A realistic approach for defining, analyzing, and balancing resource demands against resource capacity. And the solution to that is that the project managers most often are leaned upon or are expected to be the experts who in fact have fingers on the keyboard, if you will, to be stating the resource demands against that limited capacity, or to be identifying where the pinch points are between their project and other projects. So the project managers typically are required to have a broad skill set that really are geared towards performing project leadership to be a solid project manager. And the responsibility for scheduling falling on the shoulders of the project management community typically creates issues, especially when the project management community gets beyond 3 or 4 project managers. We've seen situations where 3 or 4 project managers might be able to handle their day-to-day project leadership capabilities as well as the day-to-day planning and scheduling within a project management tool. But once that community grows beyond 3 or 4, it really becomes pretty unrealistic to expect the project managers to have scheduling responsibility. And what we see as a solution is to transfer scheduling responsibility to a dedicated master scheduling function. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we get into some of the details around the solutions. I first want to cover the 6 symptoms and the 6 causes and the 6 solutions, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the ones that are the most common. The clarity of roles between resource managers and project managers. So oftentimes there's not necessarily a clear definition between what the project manager's responsibility is with the project management tool and the resource manager's responsibility is with the project management tool, as well as the supporting processes required to make that project management tool effective. A big one we see is the approach that's taken by the organization to achieve project management maturity really being built on a solid foundation of estimating accuracy, adoption of schedule costs, and labor baselining. Let me break down that mouthful just for a second. In order to have a balanced resource demand against resource capacity, there's really a lot of fundamental assumptions that go into what's required to do that well. For example, even if a project manager knows how to use Microsoft Project, for example, to state resource demands, one of the first questions is, how do we know the estimate is accurate? So how do we get some sort of consistency around the way we do task estimating? How do we adopt schedule cost and labor baselining? Meaning, if we're going to have the ability to balance capacity versus demands, usually what we need is some ability to know what changed in the schedule, what changed in the budget, what changed in the labor estimates, in order to understand where the problems are cropping up with the capacity versus the demand balancing. Meaning that even if we had an initial balanced capacity versus demand view of our project portfolio, as things change, we're going to want to know, well, what's causing these changes and where do we go to identify what's causing the upset in what once was a balanced view of the world. Another solution that we suggest is a standardization of life cycle methodology phase terminology. In other words, to have a language that the project management community can use in order to break down the projects, to put them into work breakdown structures, because ultimately having a realistic work breakdown structure and a standardized work breakdown structure leads to the effective measurement of progress on a reasonable tracking and reporting cycle. What we mean is, again, the way organizations typically mature is they get good at planning first and then tracking and analysis later. And to have a really balanced resource capacity against resource demands, we really need to have an ongoing, not just initial plan, but an ongoing tracking and analysis of that plan to identify where changes are occurring, where the baselines are slipping, and to do all that requires some standardization in the life cycle methodology to really give a standard flow of how the projects are going to unfold, at least from a high-level phase terminology standpoint. The third symptom is the project management community is overwhelmed by the effort required to maintain the project plan. So we hear very, very often, yes, we'd like to use Microsoft Project Server, but you have to understand we're different. Our organization moves fast, things happen very rapidly, and we don't really have the time to embrace these tools and to really keep these plans up to date. We really we'll overwhelm our project management community if we ask them to maintain their project plans. And that's a very, very common symptom that we see. And oftentimes when we take a step back and we start doing some cause analysis, what we'll see is that there's really been some difficulty in defining a realistic vision and roadmap for the future that's appropriate to the organization's maturity, meaning that, yes, if we ask project managers to do resource balancing and risk management and status reporting and portfolio reporting and all the other things that we're asking project managers to do when we put a new tool in, oftentimes what we'll see is that there's an inappropriate match between the maturity and the readiness of the project management community versus the requirements that are being placed on them from that initial solution. As many of you have seen in enterprise project management solutions, in the current state across the top vendors or those that are in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, there's a significant capability to these tools. And if you take an enterprise project management tool and try to turn on too many of the features at once, we'll see the overwhelming of the project management community. And like any good human being, when we get overwhelmed as project managers, we'll go into shutdown mode, meaning we just won't use the tool at all. The other solution is, when there is a good tactical plan that really has a realistic recognition of the maturity of the organization and really has a solid roadmap in place, that there's a real connection between the tactical components of the roadmap to an implementation and support plan, And you'll see when I get into the details, I'll talk about column 1, column 2, and column 3. In this particular solution here, it's talking about the connection of column 1, or the upfront assessment, to the column 3, which is the governance and adoption processes. The fourth symptom we see is that the technology vendor is getting blamed for the inability to achieve the expectation. So we'll hear that, you know, Microsoft just really didn't do a very good job, or there's too many bugs in the tool, or there's the features aren't really well conceived. And I'm not putting a symptom out there to say that it, you know, that it never happens that there's a bug in a release, or that it always happens that the functions are well conceived and well designed. But really, when we start looking at the causes, what we see is that the approach to enterprise project management really typically doesn't do, in those that fail, a very good job of integrating the technology and the people capabilities, an appropriate level of process and executive support and governance to really accompany that technology solution. So the solution we see to this symptom and this really root cause is to acknowledge that failed technology deployments are really rarely caused by inadequate functionality. So to really look in the mirror, for the organization to really take a strong look in the mirror and to acknowledge that a failed technology deployment is usually not the technology, to at least have an open-mindedness and a willingness to acknowledge that maybe that's the case, that just slopping off the blame on the technology vendors is really not going to really bring a realistic solution. So if we take a step back and we start to take a look at what are the real solutions, what we really get is the opportunity to do an analysis of the issues with the technology implementation, and really to take a look at what was happening with the adoption, what were the problems, to take a broad review of all the components of a solid solution, meaning the solution just isn't about the tools, but it is about the processes, and it is about the capabilities of the people, and to take that holistic view of the issue through a complete analysis to really see what the problems are and whether the organization is in fact ready to address and face those problems. So that holistic approach that integrates that whole view will oftentimes really be a test for the executive support of the solution. Is there really a mood towards getting the benefits of EPM solutions, and is senior management ready to embrace it? The fifth one I want to talk about is the organizational belief that the technology can't meet the organizational needs. This is sort of the unwanted stepchild of the blaming the technology vendor. 4 and 5 are somewhat related, as you'll see, that there's when an organization is unable to embrace technology, or when an organization says, you know, we looked at that technology and it just won't do the job for us, oftentimes there's really a lack of internal expertise needed to realize the benefits of advanced enterprise functionality of a tool like Microsoft Project Server. So we've tried it, we've kicked the tires, doesn't seem like it can do the job for us, but the question we often ask at that time is, who was it that really had the expertise to be able to do a complete analysis of what this technology can do at a pretty nitty-gritty level of detail? So the solution we suggest there is to develop an approach that demonstrates to senior management the value of project management solutions, so that there's an investment in the internal expertise required to get these benefits. I mean, if you can't invest in the expertise to embrace the technology, there's really not going to be much success with that. One of the examples or the analogies I often use is the concept of buying an F-16 without having any fighter pilots on staff. So, you know, we can maybe go to the air show in Paris every year and go pick out some of the most advanced fighter jets that are available in the marketplace today. But buying, you know, a fighter jet from the U.S. Air Force versus the Israeli Air Force versus the French Air Force, if you don't have fighter pilots, you're still going to end up in a smoking wreck at the end of the runway when it's all said and done. So blaming it on the F-16 and deciding to move to a Mirage fighter instead probably is going to produce different results. So what we often see here is, what's the ROI? You know, what's the case that's being demonstrated to senior management that says this is really not just about bringing in project management tools, and it really is not just about saying, well, I already invested in the PMO and they ought to know how to do this, but that the PMO really is viewed as a liaison or as a conduit to go get expertise in the marketplace, whether that's from companies like Project Assistance who can do that on a consultative basis, or whether it's that full-time expertise that ultimately is going to be needed within the organization anyway. So acquire the expertise with the appropriate roles and responsibilities, and then really to ensure that whatever plans being put in place, whatever requirements are being developed for the implementation of the technology, that there really be a progression of the project management maturity where we parallel the maturity of the features of the technology as well as the improvement of the capabilities of the people involved and the supporting processes to make that happen. And number 6, before we dive into some of the details, is a very common symptom, which is the projects are still over budget, they're understaffed, they're late, and they're lacking quality. So the problems we had when we came into this still exist, and the cause is really a series of 3 questions. Was there too much too fast in terms of implementing the technology? Were the goals misaligned with really what the organization was looking for? Was it over-designed or over-scoped, especially in the standpoint of an early warning system? If you look at an early warning system, it really goes along the concept of beginning with the end in mind. If we're looking at an enterprise project management solution, one of the first questions we can ask is, what are you trying to get it to tell you? What is it that you're looking for that executive dashboard, if you will? What kind of information, what kind of metrics, what kind of key performance indicators are we looking at in order to see whether or not projects are happening on time or not, or I'm sorry, whether projects are being successful? And as we ask those questions, when we look at the answers that we get, we'll get a sense pretty quickly on whether this early warning system, these key performance indicators, are being over-designed or over-scoped, meaning that when we see a very large scope for, we want indicators around how risk is going. We want indicators about how the budget is against baseline. We want indicators about how resources are meeting their schedules, or how well they're putting their time in. We want metrics around the details of how specific milestones are being met across the project. So if we start looking at, for example, the project management body of knowledge and the knowledge areas around scope management, risk management, human resource management, time management, if we're seeing an enterprise project management solution that out of the gate is trying to have an early warning system to address all those various aspects of that project management body of knowledge, that's a red flag. Right? So the solution is at the foundation of an effective project management solution really has to be carefully planned, has to be patiently implemented to ensure the subsequent layers of improvement and professional rigor necessary is able to be achieved based on this solid foundation. That's a mouthful. Carefully planned, patiently implemented, and ensures that the subsequent improvement has professional rigor. When we look at the desire to manage labor against the baseline, that's a pretty rigorous step in project management maturity. To collect timesheets, to estimate from those resources what the estimate to complete is, to baseline those plans, to continually keep those plans up to date based on a solid estimating methodology, is a fairly sophisticated amount of rigor, and it really requires a very solid foundation to achieve. So when we look at an initial and somewhat simple foundation that lacks initial rigor necessary to achieve all promises, this is the only proven approach that will enable full vision. So initial, simple foundation that really intentionally lacks rigor, meaning going all the way down to managing resources and budgets. Most enterprise project management solutions have to think about doing schedules first, or if they're going to go to budget and labor management, they're going to have to do that at a high level initially. And then those subsequent foundations can be built to go to a greater level of rigor. Once we can prove that we can do this at a simple level, then we can add complexity. So how do we get to complex solutions? We start with simple solutions. So let's talk about these solutions in some greater detail. The most common, a lot of the problems we talked about, a lot of the symptoms, a lot of the causes of those symptoms really come about in what I call column 2. So in other words, the efforts made to go out and infrastructure implementation. By infrastructure, we mean people, process, and technology. We mean the training on the process to use the technology. The preponderance of investment happens in column 2, and a lot of these symptoms and the causes that we talked about today really come out of an overemphasis on column 2 at the expense of what I call column 1 and column 3. Column 1 being, did we really take a step back before we started rolling technology and tools and process out and take a look at the current state to future state, how big the gap is between the current and the future, and what it's going to take to close it. And even if 1 and 2 are done well, once this technology is implemented, that there really is a portfolio governance or a project execution governance process supporting this entire solution. So let's take a closer look at what we mean by that. In terms of these common problems, we see, as I mentioned, the preponderance of the spend really happening in column 2. So instead of spending significant time in the first column, we see a lot of promises and a lot of expectation building, really not a lot of time and effort and a lot of investment in that first assessment column. We then see the preponderance of the spend, as I mentioned, in column 2, buying technology, buying training. I'm oftentimes saying we'll get to the process later, or we already have process, we'll just tell people to use it. And then really once that implementation is put in, to really tell people, okay, now it's in, you have to use it. And oftentimes what happens is we're back to square one. So talk, spend, talk is the recipe for failure that we're looking at here, that we really want to break down a little bit into finer detail. And initially, from a solution standpoint, I call this the project. If we're going to put a project management solution in, what is that realistic set of requirements that we're going to provide for in order to get that solution? What is it that we can do in terms of understanding our future state, our current state, how wide the gap is, and to have a strategy to close that gap? So we have a strong recommendation around the tactical planning, scoping, and chartering that needs to happen in order to really do that final step in column 1, which is to have a realistic set of requirements. So what do we mean by that? What we're really talking about is having a methodology that has a way to reflect upon what the organization can do. And we hear, when we talk to our customers and our prospects about this column 1, it's not uncommon for us to hear somebody say, well, we know we're a 0, or we know we're a 1, so we're not really that anxious to spend a lot of time thinking about what our current state is. And I have to acknowledge and agree with that yes, it is true that oftentimes that the initial state of maturity is pretty low. And really what that brings us to is to say, okay, then let's focus on the future state. Where are you trying to get to, and how fast are you trying to get there? Because it's really that current capability assessment against that future state that gives us a preliminary gap analysis that really provides a vision of the future state of maturity, how wide the gap is, and to then set some recommendations and goals for action before we start to gather requirements. It's not uncommon for us to get a customer come to us with maybe a spreadsheet or a 5-page document that has a whole lot of requirements about what the organization is looking to do without really phasing that set of requirements. Maybe with some acknowledgement that we are trying to digest a lot pretty quickly, but we're not really sure what order we want to do this in. So it's really in the tactical planning that takes into account the current state, the future state, how wide the gap is, to provide a charter, a real project charter that details the scope required to move to a future state. And if you think about a project charter, especially for those of you, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with project management methods and tools, we're talking about the same thing that we would have for a project, a real charter that answers the questions that a real charter should answer. What are the deliverables? What's the approach? Who are the resources that are going to be involved? What's the investment? What's the schedule? What are the assumptions? What are the limitations? What's in and out of scope? To really do a very fine job of defining that tactical plan, so that now when we get to column 2 and we use the word requirement, we're going to have a requirement for an enterprise project management solution. If we have a tactical scope or a tactical plan or a charter, what we're really going to have are boundaries around requirements that on purpose exclude requirements that are too much for the organization to digest in a phase 1 implementation. That, we see, is one of the primary requirements to not put in an unrealistic set of requirements for an enterprise project management solution. So linking the tactical plans to the strategic goals, and then having what I would call a digestion plan that answers the question, how do you eat the cow? And the answer is one bite at a time. And this really gives us an approach to say, let's look at a one bite at a time approach. So a tactical plan really is about saying we have a process plan, we have a technology plan, we have a plan to improve people's capabilities. It's phased, it's not all at once, and it's really based on a solid change management plan. So conceptually, it looks like what you're looking at on slide 20 here. Meaning that we have, yes, we're going to do process and technology and people, but we're going to do that realistically, and we're going to have a plan for change, which I'll talk about when we get to column 3. What might a simple phase 1 tactical plan look like? And this is truly simple, simpler than we would probably recommend, but simple is good. We might train the project managers to use that life cycle methodology, that standardized phase terminology that really provides completion milestones for each phase. We would have a realistic work breakdown structure with resources defined and updated in the project management tool based on that project life cycle methodology. What do we mean by a project life cycle methodology? Whether it's IT, systems development life cycle is one example, a drug development life cycle based on the Food and Drug Administration and here in the U.S. For how clinical trials are done. We might be a government procurement methodology. All of these methodologies require some standard phraseology for the phraseology used for how we're going to look across our project plans. Certainly a risk plan definition, not necessarily a way to qualitatively or even quantitatively track those risks, but at least have a plan in place in a tactical plan, probably with some kind of qualitative tracking. Regular status reporting, where we're going to have schedule updates against the current milestones against a baseline. And on purpose here, this doesn't say track resources. That's not to say that we've never done a successful phase 1 tactical plan that has resource tracking in it, but I'll get to that when I get to some of the phase 2 solutions in terms of what we'd recommend to include resource management into a phase 1 tactical plan, and then certainly actual versus baseline with the project summary. Budget, and oftentimes that budget is going to be resource-based, but I'm using the word summary here on purpose. It's not detailed to the work breakdown structure. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we get to that column 2 spend, where we're going to take a set of requirements and develop a spec, develop a solution, install it, configure it, implement it, train it, roll it out. So I'm not going to go through what I'll call the price of admission, which is, yes, of course, if you're going to do a solution implementation, you have to have some approach to define your spec, to deploy it, to configure it, to train on it. That's an assumption. What I really want to talk about are what are some of the underlying issues that trip up the ability to do this well. And it's really from the standpoint of what I've already talked about. We have a process not based on theory, but process-specific and even organization-specific. We have technologies and tools that are based on an organization-specific process. We have the people capabilities aligned with the theory and process, organization-specific, aligned with the technology and tools. We mentioned having a change management plan in place, and then on top of all that, the executive support. So let's peel a layer off about what's happening here. Usually what's happening with an enterprise project management solution is we're trying to get beyond the Gantt chart, right? So we have a project manager or an organization that's waving the white flag saying, you know, just relying on Gantt charts isn't doing it for us. We're trying to make commitments to the organization. We have investment in our projects, and we continually miss those commitments. And we have a strong inkling, and we've done some analysis maybe, that says a lot of the source of our anguish and our pain and our angst and our inability to meet commitments has to do with project plans that are based on schedules that have no underlying support. So we wave the white flag and we say, you know, folks, we've got to get beyond the Gantt chart. We're going to have to go do something that looks like balancing capacity versus demand. So a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of those EPM solutions are saying it's not good enough just to publish Gantt charts. We're going to want to go in there and know whether or not we can meet our commitments. We're going to want some detail. And so even if we build that house of cards, if we resource those project plans, and if we have project managers that go out there and go through the painstaking detail of opening a Microsoft project plan and fiddling with the units and the work and the task type, like fixed units, fixed work, fixed duration, and all those fields we have to wrestle into submission to get a balanced plan, the real challenge becomes that there's a constant change in the resource demands. Estimates change. Scopes change. The requirements change. all of these changes ultimately lead to a continual reshuffling of that card deck and a constant need to restack the capacity versus demand. And that ongoing challenge is really what causes our project management community to say, you know, this is too much. We really are really being overwhelmed by this. So when we talked about that challenge, and I'll just go back to that just for a minute to show it to you, to tell you which one we're talking about. We're going to see where the project managers in symptom number 3 that we talked about, they're overwhelmed. Right? Difficulty defining a realistic vision and a roadmap for the future that's appropriate to the organizational maturity. What do we get when the community is overwhelmed by the effort required to maintain project plans? We get this human system shutdown. We get this inability to use the solution realistically, and that shutdown leads to the issues we're talking about here, which is, you know, we have this house of cards that's now come tumbling down. We have this inability to constantly change the project plans. We have this statement that says we move too fast. We really can't use project management tools because they don't really do what we need them to do. We've tried and it doesn't work. And I would acknowledge that, yes, that's often true. And when we think about what's missing in the solution implementation, we can go back to oftentimes the maturity model. If we look at time management and we look at how a lot of organizations mature, we see that to go from no formal time estimating, and I'll read level 1, and I know this print's probably small for some of you trying to look at this, so I'll read level 1. If we have no formal time estimating techniques, if the project plans are not status for labor or cost or schedule, and the projects are baselined, we're by definition a level 1 organization. Yet, if we want to get the promise of capacity versus demand balancing, we're probably looking at something like a level 4 or level 5. Let me read level 4 to you. Historical schedules and labor actuals are utilized to improve estimating. We perform earned value analysis. All projects are formally baselined to enable effective measurement of variances, meaning we know where changes are happening, we know where estimates are changing, we know where the actuals are being collected and causing those initial estimates to look invalid or incorrect. And labor is tracked at the work breakdown structure level of detail. So it's pretty common for an organization to come to us and say, we want to turn timesheets on in Microsoft Project. Well, it starts to imply the need to go through level maturity 2 and 3. Estimating techniques for projects are applied. Projects are status for schedule. We start to baseline them. We start to have a change control process for how schedule revisions are applied. We go beyond labor tracking at the project summary level. Oftentimes, there's a system in place that's already doing tracking, but it's at the summary level of the project, or maybe the entire project. So these are big challenges. And ultimately, what we recommend, and I mentioned briefly under solution number 3 when we were back on slide 11, is that this separation of the duties between a resource manager and a project manager, and oftentimes the challenge we see is maybe an acknowledgement, that there's a role called a resource manager, and that we're going to ask those resource managers to be using Microsoft Project. Maybe we try to take the burden off their shoulders, and that's not really what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a centralizing of the master scheduling function, and specifically a centralizing of the knowledge required for a master scheduler to be able to go into Microsoft Project at the assignment level and be able to update and stay on top of that house of cards that's continually being blown over by changes in scope, schedule, resource requirements within the projects. So a master scheduler really can utilize the technology to state resource capacity and continually update resource demands, and allow the project managers to supply accurate resource demand for the active projects, feed that to the master scheduler, and then go on to the goal of really being out there and being a project leader, doing what I call insurance salesman or insurance salesperson, because that's what we as project managers are. We're out there selling insurance all the day, and what's insurance? It's the ability to reduce risk. It's the ability to make a claim, if you will, to get those contingency plans in place, to figure out why we should push off some of those scope changes to a later phase. To do all of that, operating in the gray area that project managers need to do is very time-consuming and ultimately destroys the ability for enterprise project management solutions to be successful when we ask the project manager to also be the fingers on the keyboard. So that's a very important point, and one of the primary reasons we see rescues become necessary, because the organization doesn't recognize the need to make those investments, or it recognizes the need, but it really structures the master scheduling function improperly, and as a result, it can't be successful. So I want to come down to the short strokes on our presentation today by getting to the adoption and governance model. And really by adoption and governance, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about not just a set of project management processes implemented in column 2 or defined in column 1, but really a vision that says my tactical plan that I developed in column 1 included a change management plan, and change management is really about governance. A successful change management plan, as I mentioned here on slide 20, if we have a tactical plan that has process, technology, and people, a change management plan is really the plan that is executed as we emerge from column 2 and we jump into column 3 and we talk about how do we execute the projects, but how do we do that side by side with an adoption and a governance mentality. So you see the top part is about execution. Let's go deliver on time, on budget, on spec. But the governance is about the integration of process, technology, and training to make that happen, to provide the coaching and mentoring, by the way, oftentimes from somebody like a master scheduler that's taking the burden off the project managers, that's reducing the problems we see when we have unrealistic data coming out of the project plans. Okay, so we start to see really the 6 symptoms that we saw are pretty tightly coupled. There's really not an ability to balance the capacity and demand without thinking about the internal expertise we need to get advanced enterprise functionality using or working. To integrate the technology at a level of process and executive support and governance. All these things we talked about in the symptoms now come into focus. Okay, so the coaching, mentoring, the process adoption and audit, the reporting and escalation, all of those things we talked about a little bit earlier, but I want to just go into a little bit more detail. When I mentioned talk, more talk, or when we did the methodology, that when I showed the first 3 columns, and I talked about talk, spend, talk back here on slide 17. One of the primary bullets here said, send do it or else memos. And they're usually not worded that way. They're usually not worded like I have here on what I usually refer to as the memo from Bob. Right, making changes stick. Well, yeah, we're going to do a solution rollout, and then we're going to send out something that says, you know, a week from Monday, you're expected to apply all that training that you had, and you're expected to do it well. You're expected to adhere to the PMO policies. I also refer to this as the Moses model of a PMO, meaning that we act like Moses. We bring the stone tablets down from the mountain, and we hand out the 10 Commandments, and then we use those 10 Commandments as a weapon, meaning we beat you over the head with them and say, follow the process. Okay, so or as the memo from Bob here concludes, failure to do so will result in the beatings continuing until morale improves. So we're talking about really a supportive, we use the term support usually when we talk about adoption and governance. When we think about integrating coaching and mentoring and process adoption and audit and reporting and escalation, we're really talking about the ability to go out there and help our project managers. And not only that, but again, when we talk about evaluating projects, some way to standardize not necessarily not only how the projects are doing, but how the governance process is doing. Are we following the process? I've heard organizations say we bring most of our projects in on time and on budget, but when you look at what's really going on, oftentimes it's because there's no tracking of the initial scope, no tracking of the initial schedule and budget estimates, so we can say we hit the schedule because we hit the one we updated last week, not the one we had 6 months ago. So that ability to go out there and look at and evaluate projects and to really score them, right? Do they have issues? Is the project under control? Are we delivering on time on spec and we have issues, but there's an action plan in place to mitigate them? Or we're not on time and on spec and there is no plan to get back on track? Or we have no plan to get on track and they don't think the thing's going to fail. Or it's failing right now, and oh, by the way, instead of letting it fail, why don't we stop it? Okay, so and there's all kinds of actions that can come out of this. This is a very simplified view, and if you saw the Making It Stick webinar we did last year, we went into greater detail here. So if you're looking for more detail here, certainly you can go back to our website and review some of those previous webinars. Well, what did come out of a project review? Well, based on the outcomes, based on the evaluation, we might say we're going to keep it on a regular monthly reporting cycle. Or if it's starting to develop issues, maybe we're going to start reporting to some additional stakeholders within the organization. Or if there's no plan to get back on track, maybe we're going to have an increase the reporting cycle and start having some of the owning executives or stakeholders attend the status meetings and hear how things are going. Or we may say, well, if it's out of control and there's no plan to get back on control and the project manager doesn't look like that they're going to do that anytime soon, we may replace the project management leadership. We may increase the reporting escalation to steering committees and senior executive presence. And of course, we may have a formal way to cancel the project. So the PMO oftentimes is in concert with the business steering committees to help drive the change. So part of this initial column 1 process to lay out a charter, to get a mission in place, to set goals for the organization's use of project management really can include this governance process and start talking about the lines of authority. When does escalation occur? Who has the authority to cancel a project? What if we need more time and more money to get a project done? What happens if we're out of line with the original expectations? How do we get project managers replaced or counseled? And if we're not going to if it looks like there's no way we're going to hit the project's goals, why don't we stop it? How do we do that? So that's what we mean by governance process, to do that formally. And the cost of doing nothing is high. Oftentimes when there's not portfolio and project management rigor, bad projects continue. They're not canceled in a timely manner. Good money is sent after bad. We see use it or lose it budgets. That's another symptom of a portfolio management process not going well. We do certain projects, and when we get to the end, because we don't have a good solid view of all of our projects, we spend or we lose it. So we just go ahead and spend the money instead of losing the money. And we rely on the status quo, meaning that it is risky. Doing an enterprise project management solution, like any project, has a risk of failure. And so sometimes it's easier to just allow the embedded culture to continue the way it is than it is to stick our necks out and go ahead and do something about it. So the ability to directly link making and keeping resource commitments to the need for accurate resource data provides a solid foundation for the business case. Meaning, if we can show you we can hit our commitments, we can get an investment in solutions like this. So one of the monitoring techniques to demonstrate progress to stakeholders, when I mean progress in improving project management and portfolio management, putting a solution like this in place, is we can ask the question, are bad projects failing faster? Are we freeing up resources for more worthy initiatives? So we can see that we're not meeting the project goals or delivering on the requirements, not delivering the value, not matching stakeholder requirements, poor implementation. All of these symptoms are really problems with an organization that's not managing projects well. And instead of the classic, what's the return on an investment, can you show me how long projects used to take and how long they're taking now, that's tough to do. Right? It's really tough to do because there's usually not a good before picture. What were we doing before? Because we don't have the measurements in place. So we find that looking at whether an organization is getting to cancel projects gives us an initial starting point. If they weren't canceled on before, now we have a starting point. Let's measure how we're canceling, or let's measure how we're spending in the fourth quarter and see if we're starting to smooth out that process through a good portfolio governance process, which actually can come in, let's say, the middle of a budget year and cancel a project and put a new one on the books. So we see projects finishing sooner. We see cost overruns eliminated or reduced. We see ineffective projects getting canceled when this is going well. So let's talk about next steps for a few minutes before I open the floor for questions. One of the things I just want to mention as we go into the next steps here is for any of those who are new to our webinar series, just wanted to spend a minute on this idea of what project assistance does, and then we'll talk about the next steps where we may be involved. One of the things we do, the primary thing we do is we transform our clients' approach to portfolio and project management. And really, the way we do that is by achieving a standard of excellence in execution. Excellence in execution meaning running the projects, consistently delivering the project outcomes. And as I mentioned, there's reluctance to put these infrastructures in place. So what we really deliver is the promise of getting past that reluctance, right? So really to be able to reduce the risk of putting these solutions in place, to be able to really maximize the investment by getting victories early in the process. So what that really gets to is speed the realization of value, to put a phased approach in place that says we can create a continued move towards investment by getting that initial investment to produce something early that's worth continuing. So that at the end of the day, we really start to drive effective organizational change, like any change that occurs by the minute, by the day, by the hour, not by the quarter, by the year. So just like the question is, how does a project get to be late? And the answer is one day at a time. That's the same way the change is going to occur, one day at a time. And it's really by taking those tenets you see in front of you and putting them in place. So our practices are really primarily bound around our project and portfolio management services, which springs into our portfolio collaboration services based on SharePoint. So we have a strong SharePoint practice in addition to our enterprise project management practice that's based on Microsoft Project Server. Education and competency development, again, out of the solutions, we see process and we see people capability, so there's a training component. Application development in column 2, we do an awful lot of integration of solutions around enterprise project management platforms. The outsourcing of project management, which really grew out of our staffing practice, so we do, in addition to putting solutions in place, we also manage projects, and we can do that on an outsourced basis or a by-the-hour basis, so that's what those last 2 blocks are. And then actually solutions that run on top of Microsoft Project, specifically one here that gets to an easier way to balance capacity versus demand. So next steps, what we can do is we can do a complimentary maturity improvement readiness briefing. Okay, so if you're thinking about whether your organization is ready for portfolio and project management, we can look at some of your reporting. Oftentimes that's a trouble sign, how organizations are trying to report, so we can certainly do a critique of that. The technology environment, the resource planning methods, and really the overall governance process that says when we put technology in, folks, this is not optional. That's what column 3 is about, how this is not optional. So we can look at all those aspects of how you're planning the solution, what the technology environment looks like, how your resource planning methods are going, because as you can see here, these 4 bullets are about evaluating the most common pitfalls that we see around around enterprise project management solutions. So we review we have a methodology we use to look at your capabilities through your current desired future state. We have a methodology for that. I showed you one of the bands there when I showed the maturity of time management. We have that for all the aspects of portfolio and project governance in terms of a tried and true methodology. We can review how we can use a roadmap to justify your investment and then really tackle some of those common challenges. And really, these challenges you see here are very much in sync with the 6 symptoms we saw about why project rescues are needed. So the next steps, you can contact Jan. I'm about to turn the floor back over to Jan to look at your questions that you put into the console, but you see Jan's phone number here, Jan's email address, our website, and then a link to go to see our upcoming webinars. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jan.
Okay, thanks, Gus. We have already received a few questions, so I'm just going to dive right into that. Per the slide showing project management maturity levels 1 through 5, is that related to CMMI 1 through 5? That is, if my organization wants to be at CMMI level 3, do we only want or need to use EPM at the appropriate parts of project management maturity level 3?
That's a good question. And for those of you who are not familiar with CMMI, CMMI is a methodology for measuring maturity of software engineering. It came out of Carnegie Mellon University, the Software Engineering Institute. So for those of you who are not involved in software engineering, bear with me for a moment because we do have 2 other questions here I'm going to answer, but I'm going to take them in the order that they came in here. Project management maturity, the Kerzner model really was based on CMMI, but was not intended. The fast answer is no. CMMI level 3, achieving CMMI level 3 does not presume achieving project management maturity level 3. Part of getting on the path of CMMI maturity really requires a basic project management process to be in place. So CMMI does not have really as many specifics about what those specifics need to be, but for example, when we look at life cycle methodology, or in the case of CMMI, software development life cycle or software engineering life cycle, they're going to recommend in CMMI that you have a basic project management process in place. Why? Because we really can't measure our effectiveness unless we have some way to measure our projects. So the basic assumption is that there's basic project management process in place. Getting the CMMI 3 can happen with a basic project management process in place.
Thank you. When people or organizations leave Microsoft Project, what is the success rate when they move to other tools such as PlanView or Clarity?
Okay, so we're talking about, I'll go back to the symptoms. I'm just going to, bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to catch that slide here. It's blaming the technology is, I'm going to say that that falls into that one, which we call slide 12. And slide 12 says technology vendor blame for inability to achieve expectations. As a matter of fact, one of the first slides I had, that question is related to this slide, and it's also related to one of the first slides I had put up, actually the first one I put up after the agenda, which is slide 7. We're really talking about sort of part 2 of bullet number 3. Bullet number 3 says we write it off or we go try to rescue it, right? It's really the first part of bullet 3. The write-offs happen, I would say, is a first step to abandoning the technology. So the first half of slide 7, abandoning the technology, then leads to, I'll say, slide 11, which is, oh, if we're going to justify abandoning the technology, oops, it's not slide 11, it's slide 10, right? Nope, slide 12. If we're abandoning the technology, let's blame the vendor, and of course what happens then is we go buy another piece of technology. So really the question, the way I would read that question is, how many folks have successfully abandoned project because it was the problem, and then they move to a tool such as PlanView and Clarity? I can tell you from our perspective, we've seen this problem both ways. We've seen organizations that can't implement Clarity and go to PlanView or Project. They can't implement Project, they go to PlanView or Clarity. The symptoms are all the same. If we're throwing away the technology, the cause is probably the approach to the enterprise project management, not integrating technology with the people and the process. And as you see here, the solution's still the same, right? If you think throwing away a tool like Microsoft Project Server and going to PlanView and Clarity is going to solve your problems, I would say take a gut check on bullets number, actually all 3 of the solutions on slide 12 here. We haven't really seen much of a success rate from there. Are there sometimes, if you compare apples to apples and features and functions, might there be something that Project does better than PlanView, or something Clarity does better than Project? Absolutely. I don't mean to say that that's not the case, or we just haven't seen that as a driver for why people abandon their project solutions. I think we're out of time.
We are.
Okay. Are there any questions we didn't get answered? No? Okay. So what I'd like to do then for today is to thank you all for your time, and this recording will be out on the website sometime soon, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. Jan, did I miss anything?
No, that's all. I should have it up in an hour.
Okay, it should be up within the hour. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate your attendance, and have a good day.